لم يخلق الرحمن مثل محمد بين الورى بشرا على الإطلاق. لم يخلق الرحمن مثل محمد بين الورى بشرا على الإطلاق. كلا ولا عرف الخلائق قدره ما فوقه حقا سوى الخلاق. كلا ولا عرف الخلائق قدره. كلا ولا عرف الخلائق قدره ما فوقه حقا سوى الخلاق.
Assalamu alaikum everyone. You are listening to episode 84 of the Muhammad Laylan podcast with yours truly as the host. I pray that each and every single one of you is in the best of states of health and wellness. You and your families and loved ones. These are some dangerous times. This coronavirus, the COVID-19 disease that it causes, this is some serious business. And I can't emphasize that enough. It's understandable that many of you may not really grasp what the big deal is. There's some conspiracy theories that are floating around and people think that it's some government hit job. It is not. This is a serious affair. And the reason you may not grasp that, and none of us really can really get it, is because we don't have a frame of reference. The last time human beings experienced a pandemic to this scale was 1918, the Spanish flu. Even those outbreaks that we've experienced previously, like the last one with the Ebola break, for example, Ebola killed 28,000 people. It was quickly contained. It was isolated to certain areas. There were some qualities about it that prevented it from becoming a worldwide infection, a pandemic, which is why we don't really grasp what this is about. The 1918 Spanish flu killed 50 million people. So we don't have a frame of reference. Our parents don't even have a frame of reference. A lot of people, that's why you see these two kind of polarized reactions. Either a total just like, what is all of this about? Why are people crazy? And you're just going about your day as if nothing is going on. Or fighting in supermarkets over toilet paper. There is something serious that's going on. So what I thought I would do in this episode is go through a number of points, specifically 6 points about coronavirus and COVID-19. And what I hope out of this episode, and the reason I'm really feeling motivated to record this episode specifically, is because I've seen through meetings or what I've observed online with some discussions, because a lot of people are unable to grasp the gravity of this, there are some seriously irresponsible decisions being made in terms of whether to continue holding Jum'ah, whether to continue holding some events, whether it is in terms of weekly dhikr groups or classes in the mosque or anything like that. Seriously irresponsible decisions are being made. Alhamdulillah, the majority of what I've seen has been great. People are being proactive, suspending in cases praying Jum'ah at the masjid for a period of time until they get further directions from the governments about whether the public health status of this has actually gone down and we can go back to business as usual. But there are a couple of just isolated examples of some influential figures, muftis in fact, that just don't get it. And I mean, don't no disrespect with this, but they just don't get it. And we're talking about, and I don't mean to say this hyperbolically, this is literally a life and death situation. You could result in killing some people by continuing to insist on holding any events in the mosques or any group dhikrs or anything that you decide to do with the community. This is a time for you to be sensible. Social distancing is so critical for this. And you need to just trust in the process. The modeling and the projection numbers and all of that, it is painting a bleak picture. I don't mean to sound alarmist when I tell you this. What I'm going to share with you in this episode are just going to be cold, hard facts. I will share with you the resources. You'll find them in the show notes, all the primary literature that I'm drawing from. You can go and read it all if you want to. I'm not relating to you anything from Facebook, social media feeds, Facebook, Twitter, all of that. I'm not relating to you something from CNN or Fox News. This is just straight up what we know about this so far. We have enough information to tell us that this is a serious issue and you need to take it seriously. Whether you grasp it or you don't grasp it, that's irrelevant. You just need to fall in line and just go along. Otherwise, you're going to jeopardize the livelihoods of people in terms of either that you might end up killing somebody with this or causing them significant morbidity, significant physical ailments for the rest of their lives. And you'll understand this as we go through this. You'll hopefully start to comprehend what this is all about. There are 6 things I want to go through in this episode. And before I go through it, I'm just going to preempt with just saying trigger warning. Again, not alarmist, just facts. Some of the stuff might put you in an anxious state. I don't mean to make you anxious. What I want you to know is you need to be prepared. You need to exercise your knowledge here so that you become sensible with your behavior, with all of the recommendations, so that you don't result in harming other people. I hope that you share this if you find this beneficial, and I hope that I make it clear throughout the episode and I'm trying to avoid the use of jargons as much as possible. If you find it beneficial and informative, I'm going to remind you at the end of the episode. Even though I tell you, please share the episodes and it's just kind of an ad lib at the end, I cannot emphasize enough how much I want you to share this episode because I hope that this creates enough pressure on community leaders in places where they're still insisting on holding any public gatherings for Muslims in communities. Because all that has to stop right now. At the time of recording this, it is Tuesday evening, Brisbane time, March 17th. And in the next couple of weeks, if these practices are not implemented and people don't take this seriously enough, you're going to see something worse than what we're seeing in Italy right now. There are 6 points that I want to go through in this episode. First, I'm going to talk about what is coronavirus and COVID-19. Second, I'm going to talk about where did it come from. Third, how is it transmitted? Fourth, how does it impact the body? So in terms of the physiology, signs and symptoms. 5 and 6, these last 2 points are really the crux of all of this. 5th point is why are governments and people reacting the way that they're reacting? And 6 is how should we as Muslims respond individually and collectively to this? So without further ado, let's get it going. First, what is the coronavirus and COVID-19? Let's talk about what a virus is first of all. For those of you who don't have the background for this, a virus is just a small parasite that cannot reproduce by itself. If you leave a virus on its own, it will just stay as one particle and it will just sit there without doing anything. It is not technically a living thing in the same way that bacteria, for example, are living, or humans are living, or unicellular organisms are living. It's not alive in that sense. It's just an inert genetic material that's just sitting waiting. To replicate, it needs to infect a cell, where it can direct the cell's replication machinery to produce more viruses. The entire infectious virus particle is called a virion, and it consists of an outer protein shell that houses the genetic material and nucleic acid inside of it. This nucleic acid, the genetic material, could be RNA or it could be DNA, and it could be single or double-stranded. It's irrelevant what the differences are for this discussion that we're having here. I just want you to just take home from this is a virus is genetic material coated with protein inside a protein envelope, and it can't do anything until it infects a cell. And once it goes into a cell, it uses the cell's replication machinery, because living cells have to replicate, they have to divide. You want that cell needs to grow, divide into 2 cells, grow, divide into 4 cells, and continue its process. Renew itself as well. So if parts of it are dying off, it needs to renew these things, and it uses its own machinery inside with the genetic material to make new proteins. So when its proteins are used up, it uses energy to make new ones. So that's how a cell functions. A virus comes in and it takes all of that machinery that it used, the factory inside the cell that it uses to make proteins and macromolecules and all of that. It hijacks all of that and says, that's mine. And then it uses that to replicate its own genetic material, to make its own proteins. Now, viruses can infect bacteria, they can infect plants, they can infect animals, and depending on their specific structure and proteins they encode, their life cycles can differ. Now, it's important for you to note something. Viruses that can infect one type of animal don't necessarily have to infect another type, or they may not even be able to infect another type. That's where mutations are important for you to note. A virus might mutate and might change a little bit in its structure so that it's able to jump between species. So it can go from one animal type into another animal type. So, for example, you can go from a bat to a cat. But to do that, it needs to mutate. It needs to change some of its structure so that it can modify itself and adapt to that new cell type that it's infecting. Now, some viruses can incorporate into DNA sequences and they can stay silent. In fact, there is an entire field of research into how viruses over the past 4 billion years have incorporated themselves into different plants and into different animals and bacteria so that they can actually make new proteins and benefit the bacteria itself. So it's not always pathogenic. It's not always disease causing. Sometimes it actually, over a millennia, over an evolutionary timescale, it can be beneficial to the thing that it infects, and then it just becomes part of that thing, where it just goes on over time. And there are interesting fingerprints that you can highlight if you do what's called a phylogenetic analysis, where you can highlight, oh, this was a virus previously and it got incorporated, and there's certain signs for this. So that's what viruses do. Now, as I mentioned, during the late phase of the infection, the virus will hijack. So the virus can go into the cell and it can stay silent. It may just hang out. So, for example, the HIV, the human immunodeficiency virus, can infect someone, and the viral load can just stay low. So it has just a low number of virus particles, and it can just hang out in the immune cell that it infected. After a period, we don't understand exactly like the specifics of all of this, but it can be activated, and then it wants to replicate, and then it makes many of itself using the cell's machinery, and then it needs to be released. It needs to go out. So what does it do? It basically blows the cell up. So in the case of AIDS, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, that happens when the virus, the HIV, replicates and it blows up a number of those cells. So then the immune cell numbers go down. And so when you do the blood work for someone with this disease, with this syndrome, you find that their immune cells are low. The reason people with AIDS die and develop pneumonias and develop infections is because they actually can't fight off infections. Their immune system has been hijacked. The cells that make up the helper cells, they get blown up. And so they can't respond to invading pathogens that are coming through. That's what causes AIDS. Now, not all viruses are bad. Some viruses are actually good. Like we said, they incorporate into the DNA, they can make new proteins that are beneficial over an evolutionary timescale. If you've heard anything about gene therapy, where someone, let's say, is born with a defective gene, they have a problematic gene. Gene therapy research relies on viruses. They actually tag the good copy of a gene, and then they send it into a cell, because a virus will infect and go into a cell and will hijack machinery. The virus will, sure enough, go and do all of that. But the viruses that they use in this research, they're not disease causing. Their job, they've been designed to incorporate into the DNA so that someone, let's say, with a bad copy of a gene, they can receive a good copy of the gene. and then they can fix whatever that's been going on that's wrong with the proteins that are being produced by the bad copy, or maybe not produced at all, and so they can produce those proteins. So that's what gene therapy is about. It's a promising kind of new field of research. It's really interesting, fascinating. Of course, when you watch some dystopic future movies or read some dystopic novels about the future, they talk about how these viruses go bad and it can end up basically eradicating mankind. But nevertheless, it's an interesting prospect for people that have genetic disorders that this is kind of a technology that they're using. Now, I use the example of HIV and AIDS. So, HIV is the virus, and AIDS is the syndrome that the virus causes. This is what COVID 19 and coronavirus are about. Coronavirus is the virus, COVID 19 is the disease that it causes. So, that's the relationship between the two. When you hear these two terms, that's what they're talking about. And this is the current pandemic that we're experiencing. This coronavirus is a part of the family of viruses where the virus that causes the common cold, one of the viruses that causes the common cold, is actually a coronavirus. For the longest period of time, coronaviruses for human beings, you're immunocompetent. In other words, your immune system is working fine. You're a healthy person. You get a cold. It's annoying. Maybe stuffy nose, a little bit of a low-grade fever. You battle it for a couple of days, a few days, and then you get over it. And that's it. There's nothing, no fuss, no muss, really. It's just fluids and bed rest or home rest, and don't exhaust yourself too much, and you get over it. So it didn't really attract that much concern. But now we have these coronaviruses that are quite pathogenic, and they're causing a lot of problems. The current one that we have, I'm talking about now, moving on to the second point, where did it come from? Most coronaviruses originated in bats, and before mutating and infecting other animals. In other words, they're sitting in bats, they mutate, they make a jump from the bat to another animal, and then they mutate again, and they jump into the human being. Many of them that have the three that we've experienced, and I'll go through that in a second. This is the process. They jump from bats to an intermediate host, mutated again, and then they got into human beings. Now, the current coronavirus pandemic is the third one that we experience, is the third major kind of outbreak of coronaviruses that we experience. It is not the first one. The first two were in 2002 and in 2012. So starting in 2002, 2003, an outbreak of what's called SARS, and many of you might have heard of that, that SARS is the acronym that stands for Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome. That took place in the Guangdong province in China. 10 years later, we encountered the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, which is called MERS, outbreak that came out of first from Saudi Arabia. Now, in the SARS case, the coronavirus mutated and infected palm civets, the civet cats. They're like a possum with spots, I guess. You should look it up online. They eat that in China in wet markets. So if you go to the wet markets where they have all of these funky animals, bats and civet cats, and they eat all kinds of things. It's a really fascinating thing to look into. Which actually was born out of the communist cultural revolution of Marx and had to do with the famine and where all of that came about. You should take some time to look into why do the Chinese eat all of these just animals that wouldn't even occur to your mind to eat. There's a history behind that. And there's a reason why that came about. No thanks to communism. Now, that came out of it mutated in bats, from bats and jumped into palm civets. Because they're handling bodily fluids and blood in these markets, in these wet markets, after a period of time, this virus mutated again, and then it was able to attack human beings. And so that's where SARS came from. The MERS virus, the MERS coronavirus, it mutated and it infected dromedary camels. So these are camels that are used for riding or racing in Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait. So that's where it came from bats to the camels and then to human beings. So the more you interact with these domesticated animals in terms of, especially if you're going to consume them and handle their meat and handle their bodily fluids in some fashion, you're going to get it at some point. Something is gonna jump, and that's what's called a zoonotic infection. Now, the current coronavirus outbreak has not been traced to its original source as of yet. And the reason we want to trace these things, like why is it important for us to trace it? It's because we want to prevent a future outbreak. We don't want this to happen again. We want to see what kind of conditions were in place for this to happen so that we can change the way that we practice to prevent this from happening again. An early genetic analysis pointed to an ant eating pangolin, but so far, the latest findings point to a bat species found in China's Yunnan province. And the latest thing that I've read was they actually traced it back. They did a phylogenetic analysis and traced it back to like the third week of November is when this virus mutated, made the jump, and then it started, and then it could infect humans. And the first cases came out in December 2019. So that's where it came from. How is it transmitted? Now, this is the practical part that you need to pay attention to a little bit more carefully. Person-to-person transmission occurs primarily via direct contact or through droplets by coughing or sneezing from an infected individual. Now, it's important for you to know something. The person does not have to be showing symptoms. The person could be completely fine for up to something like 10 days, but their viral load increases over that period of time without showing any symptoms, and up until about 48 hours before they start to get sick, this is the highest level of viral load that they have, extremely infectious. So they could be going around, hanging out, saying salam to you. If they happen to just do a little bit of a clearing their throat, or if they sneeze at all and you're around them and you have any contact with that person, within 3 meters, you're done for. You're getting this virus. Now, a recent paper looked at how long the virus particles survive on different surfaces. And this is another important part because it's not just about, oh, I didn't hang out with this person. They looked at how long the virus will survive on different surfaces. And again, all of the links are in the show notes for all of this stuff. They found that it could be detected in aerosols for up to 3 hours. So if someone sneezes and it's airborne, up to 3 hours you can detect this. Up to 4 hours on copper. So if you have a copper surface of any kind and someone who's infected was around it and they happen to have droplets or just release shed some of that virus onto it, it will survive on that copper for up to 4 hours. If it's on cardboard, it will survive up to 24 hours. And if it's on plastic or stainless steel surfaces, so a lot of those tables and masajid and community centers is plastic. There's a lot of plastic there. It will last up to 2 to 3 days on these. Now, the conclusion from this paper was it's plausible. If this virus is viable, all you need to do is touch that surface, touch your face afterwards, and now it's in you. Something to reflect on. So it's not just, this is why they say don't go to these places, don't congregate, don't come around, because you could be shedding this virus and then someone can come after you who's well and healthy and they can pick it up. It's plausible. They haven't proven this, but it's plausible because this virus is alive in the sense that it can actually viably infect your cells. Why is this plausible? Because we know that from the measles virus. The measles virus can attach to dust particles and travel something like 300 meters. So you don't even need to be in the same room or the same area as someone. Someone could be in an open football field somewhere. If they have measles and you're in the same area and they shed that virus and you stay long enough in that area, you could pick it up because they're just traveling in the air. Which is why measles is such a big deal that we wanted to have this immunization program on, because you don't even have to be around the person, they can infect you. So this is why this is plausible when they say that if it's viable for these periods of time. Now you got a problem. You go to the masjid who has on a typical Jum'ah, depending on the masjid that you go to, whether it's 800 or 2,000 or 5,000 people attending or 10,000 people attending, if you're one of those mega mosques, who knows, and you have a few people that are infected, and we'll talk about an example later on in this episode about this, you're going to have a massive breakout. Now, how does the virus infect? It binds to what is called the angiotensin converting enzyme 2 receptor, the ACE2 receptor, on the cell surface of pneumocytes. Pneumocytes are epithelial, so these are cells of a surface that lines the lung air sacs, the alveoli, which produces something called surfactant. This thing that the pneumocytes produce, surfactant, what it does is it lowers the tension of water inside your lungs, and it allows the lining of the lungs to separate so that it can increase its capability to exchange gas. So when you breathe in, if your lung surfaces inside your air sacs are stuck together, you can't get that air in there. And if you can't get that air in there, then you're not going to have that exchange so that you can get oxygen into your bloodstream and take carbon dioxide out of your bloodstream back into the air sacs so that you can breathe it out. So this particular molecule, surfactant, allows your lungs to open up. This virus attaches to the ACE2 receptor, goes inside the pneumocytes, and then basically shuts them down, kills them off. What does that mean? It means that your cells inside your lung sacs, your air sacs inside your lung, your alveoli will be stuck together. So now you can't breathe. That's your problem. That's what it causes. That's why it causes, if you've read about it, it says interstitial pneumonia. This consolidation, this sticking together, so now you can't exchange the air. So that's how it's transmitted, and that's how quickly kind of the pathophysiology, that's how it works. Now you know how it works. How does that manifest for somebody? If somebody gets infected with this virus, well, first of all, for up to something like 9-10 days, they'll walk around, they'll be fine, they won't feel anything wrong. And then there are two types of symptoms that they will have, two categories of symptoms. There is systemic and there is respiratory. Systemically, they might get a fever, a cough, fatigue, so they'll be tired. They'll produce a lot of phlegm, might have a bit of a headache, might even cough some blood. The heart muscle might be injured. They might have hypoxemia, so this is like your blood starts to lose its oxygen content. Shortness of breath. Their immune cells numbers will go down, might have a bit of diarrhea. One thing about this coronavirus that they're finding is that in contrast to the SARS or the MERS, this one causes some stomach upset. So that's at the systemic level. For the lungs, because these coronaviruses attack usually the airways, for the lungs, you'll have runny nose, you'll sneeze, sore throat, pneumonia. So this is where your lungs just now, you start to collect fluid. And if you do that, then you might have a secondary, so subsequent to this infection, you might get bacterial pneumonia as well. And that's what they've been finding. So bacteria starts to grow, produce more fluid. On imaging, you'll find ground glass opacities. So it'll just be opaque on an image of your lungs, if that's the case. And you'll end up with a person who's infected with this ends up with acute respiratory distress syndrome. So basically, it's you can't breathe anymore. Think about it in terms of almost like drowning from the inside. No more breathing, no more gas exchange. The heart starts to fail. It's really different in the way that it impacts the body. Other coronaviruses are upper respiratory. This particular one goes down to the bottom. It goes to the lower respiratory airway. Now, 20% of those who become infected end up in ICU, intensive care unit, between 3 to 6 weeks. Now, they've been looking now at some people who survived it, especially from Hong Kong and China, and there's some case reports that have been released in the Lancet and other journals, looking at, okay, what else has happened? They found that patients who survived, they have liver damage. Right now, we don't know why that exactly is. There are a couple of theories or hypotheses. It could be because of a direct viral infection to the liver. It could be because of the drugs that they had to take while they were in ICU so that it helps them survive. Or it could be, which is, I think it's probably the most likely reason, because these coronaviruses have a way of activating the immune system and putting it into overdrive. It could be an immune mediated inflammation. So they have a cytokine storm and pneumonia associated hypoxia. So you got liver damage. The second thing that they found from ones in Hong Kong is reduced lung function, and that might be a consequence of the damage from the interstitial pneumonia and the viral injury to the lung, or it could be because of the mechanical ventilation that they had to have while they were in ICU, because they had to be on mechanical ventilator between 3 to 6 weeks. And that is not a pretty thing. It does a lot of damage. So they found that they can't even take a brisk walk without losing breath. They've calculated some of them have lost up to 20% of their lung function. Now, whether they will recover that later on, whether they'll have any changes, who knows? Who knows if this is long lasting or not? For all we know, it might be. Now, imagine a 35, 40-year-old with damaged lungs for the rest of however long they have on this planet. And then there's the post-intensive care syndrome, PICS. So when they've done some studies on people that have gone into ICU and then they come out. It's kind of like a known thing. If you go to ICU, you don't come out the same person. Something happens to the individual. And there are some studies that look at what happens to these patients. 50%, approximately 50% of patients that come out of ICU, they continue to report 1 year later, they report physical symptoms, including muscle weakness, walking difficulties. 1 in 5 patients that have come out of ICU, they develop symptoms that are similar to PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. 1 in 3 patients will experience depressive symptoms for some time. It is a life-changing experience for these patients, and it is not only because they've come close to the brink of death. The whole process itself, physically, materially speaking, just going through the ICU, and I've seen these patients and the things that are done for them and to them to help them survive and come out. It is insane just to see the level of engagement that they will have medically just to make sure that they survive this. So it's a difficult situation. Now, in terms of ICU, you might have seen some people compare the flu to the coronavirus. This is a false comparison. They're not the same disease. But just for the sake of perspective, of those who go into the ICU because of secondary pneumonia due to the flu, around 30% of them end up passing away. And usually it's an elderly population that has other comorbidities. They have other diseases. So 30%. When it comes to the coronavirus, 60 to 70% of those who went into ICU ended up passing away anyways. Now, I know that you might have heard that, it's mainly the elderly, which is, what an interesting way to put it. It's like so dismissive, like, who cares about the old people? Let them all die. Subhanallah. It is not just the elderly. It is also impacting young people. The doctor who discovered this disease, 33-year-old doctor in China, he passed away from this. Just recently, I read an article where a 47-year-old paramedic in Italy also died from this. There is a recent report looking from the UK, and a doctor basically said he's caring for a lot of 40-year-olds under his care in ICU because of this. So it is not, even though we say it's predominantly affecting elderly with comorbidities as well, so they have heart problems, they have diabetes, they have obesity, for example, they're not the only ones that are dying from this. Young people are also dying from this. Another thing regarding transmission as well that I didn't mention. Young people, now that we're talking about age and who's being impacted, children have largely been spared from this. It's an interesting phenomenon. We don't really know exactly why that is, but we have another example of another disease where children can carry the virus, infect other people. They don't get sick, but the adults get sick. That's hepatitis A. Children can carry hepatitis A, be completely healthy, have no problem, and infect other people. So the same thing with this one. Just because the child didn't get sick, it doesn't mean that they're not carrying this around and infecting others. So children could in fact be carrying the coronavirus and can go from, let's say, the school where they pick it up from somebody, and then they go back to their parents, and then their parents catch it or their grandparents catch it. This is how this thing spreads. So this is the sequelae or the after effects of the COVID-19 after you get infected. It is not a pretty sight, and the problem with this is that it's not restricted to a small number. Again, back to the comparison with the flu. The flu has an R naught, which is like think of this R naught as like how many people do you infect if you have something. So the R naught of the flu is 1. So for every one person that has a flu, they can infect another person. Just 1 to 1 ratio. This particular virus, the R naught value of it ranges between 2 to 5. Most numbers now are hovering around 3 to 4, which means for every person that carries this virus, they will infect 3 to 4 people. Now this explains to you why when you go and look at the numbers, it starts off very slow, the increased number of people who get sick, but then all of a sudden it just blows out. You just have an exponential rise of the number of infected people. When they tell you that it is 20% that will go into ICU, and you look at the numbers when you start, the problem with the discourse is it sanitizes the actual impact of this. So if you have 20% of people that are going to be impacted with this, if you have 1 million people that get this disease, that means you have 200,000 people that are going to go into ICU. Does your country have 200,000 beds in the city that you're in, for example, to handle ICU admissions? The reason people are dying from this is not also just because of the coronavirus. What they're finding in Italy right now, and if you read the case reports, they're making decisions about who lives and who dies based on age, comorbidities, and the condition that they have and what they prioritize. If you come into the ICU, if you come into the emergency room, and let's say you have another issue, you have a heart condition, you have a lung condition, you have something else that is causing you a problem, and you needed an ICU bed for any reason, that's extra pressure on the ICU beds. That's extra load on the hospitals. The reason people are dying is because the hospitals are becoming overwhelmed with the number of people that are coming through. And so what they're trying to do now is what's called flattening the curve. So when they tell you practice social distancing, don't go into large crowds, suspend any group programs, they suspended cultural programs. This is what the governments now are doing. Cultural programs, sporting events, anything that's above 500 or 250 people in some cases, they're saying no more of that. In some areas, they've now started an emergency order. So if you're in an emergency state, you can get fined, you can go to jail for it. And in one of them, I believe it's in Melbourne, it's attempted homicide if you're sick and you insist on going out. So it's a big deal, because you can just infect a lot of people and overwhelm the system and it can't handle it. So what they're trying to do now is they're trying to reduce the number of people that are getting infected at one time. They've, in many cases, acknowledged that maybe we can't stop this. It's gone too far. So the governments have 2 ways of responding to this, by the way. They're either responding reactively or they're responding proactively. The reactive responses came out of China, Italy, now the States, where they're basically waiting to see like, oh, what happens, and then they react and they do something. The proactive examples came out of Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, South Korea. Now, the interesting thing about this is Taiwan is 81 miles off the coast of China. It was expected that Taiwan was going to have the greatest number after China of people infected and dying from it. But they learned from their SARS experience and they were very proactive to quell all of this and come up with a very low number of infected people. South Korea also had a tight control on this, but they lost it with patient 31, which I'll talk about in a minute. So the government responses have really just revolved around lockdowns, cancellations of events, restrictions of group gatherings. The timeline is important for you to note. So from December 18th to December 29th, 2019, 5 patients were hospitalized with acute respiratory distress syndrome, and 1 of them died. This is in China. By January 2nd, 41 admitted hospital patients had been identified as having lab-confirmed COVID-19 infection, and less than half had underlying diseases, which included diabetes, hypertension, and cardiovascular disease. Now, there's some discussion, if you look at the literature, as to where these patients became infected, but it was concluded at the time that they were presumably infected in the hospital, so it was a nosocomial infection, at various locations through unknown mechanisms. Only patients that got clinically sick were tested as well here, so this is important to note. So the total number of infected patients was not known at the time. As of January 22nd, so we started December 18th, now we're January 22nd. December 18th, we had 5 patients hospitalized. January 22nd, 2020, a total of 571 cases of COVID 19 were reported in 25 provinces in China. January 25th, a total of 1,975 cases were confirmed to be infected with the COVID-19 in mainland China, with a total of 56 deaths. There's another report from January 24th, the day before, that estimated the cumulative incidence in China to be 5,502 cases. Now, part of that obviously is the fact that they're now testing people and they're identifying them, so that's part of why it's increasing like this. As of January 30th, a total of 7,734 cases were confirmed, and 90 other cases were reported from other countries, including Taiwan, Thailand, Vietnam, Malaysia, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Cambodia, Japan, Singapore, South Korea, the UAE, the US, the Philippines, India, Australia, Canada, Finland, France, and Germany. So far, the case fatality rate is calculated to be 2.2%. Some actually think it's a little bit higher than that, 3%. Some say it's lower than that, maybe 0.5%, because many people have mild symptoms and they don't report it, and so they're not counted in there. It's somewhere in between. If you want to average it, it's about 2 to 3% fatality rate. Compared to the flu is this is 34 times more deadly than the flu. It is a serious business. Don't think that your age is going to save you. It makes you less likely. It makes you have less risk factors for it. But plenty of young people are going into the hospital and ending up on ventilators and dying off from it. Now, at the time of recording this, the last number that I saw from the World Health Organization situation report, which was published as of March 15th, 2020, 167,511 confirmed cases globally, with 6,606 deaths confirmed. So that is a 3.9, so 4% death rate from this. Again, don't sanitize it with percentages. Talk about it in terms of serious numbers. 6,606 people died from this. The current modeling predictions for if this takes off in the US, for example, the way that they expect it to, without any measures in place, with the overwhelming of the system, the healthcare system, which is just terrible in the US anyways, but if they don't have enough ICU beds to deal with everyone. The total number of deaths in the US, from what I recall that I last read, from all-cause mortality. So everybody that has heart disease, respiratory disease, cancer, anything, 2.4 million deaths per year. This one is expected to take 1 million lives. So it's not a joke, and it is not a drill. This is a serious issue, and you need to do your part to step away from groups, social activities, do everything that you can to minimize your risk. Stock up on your grocery, but don't go into crowds of lineups, because that's just a breeding ground for more infections. Pick a time where you can just go and shop and just get and slowly stock up for the next 2 weeks to 4 weeks. Enough so that you can make sure that you can stay at home longer than you need to, longer than you normally would, without having to go out shopping. Now, there's an interesting thing I wanted to cover with you, just so that you understand how human psychology works. Why are we responding the way that we're responding? I mean, we're not an epidemiologist or infectious disease specialist, and if we don't study our history as a living thing to inform us, we end up without really having a good mental schema in place to deal with the uncertainty and confusion that many of us are experiencing right now. So instead, what we'll end up doing when we don't have a mental schema is we'll fall victim to psychological biases. And these psychological biases trap our thinking and can lead us to making decisions that are not only misinformed, but potentially disastrous in their consequences. So there's a number of biases I just want to highlight for you, and I want you to just keep in mind something. Knowing about these biases and their existence doesn't mean that you get rid of them. It just means that you know about them. Knowing about them means that you now have to pay attention to your own reactions and consciously overcome them, especially in a situation like this. So we have the normalcy bias. This refers to our tendency to expect that things will continue to occur in the future the way that they've typically occurred in the past. In other words, everything will stay normal. This leads us to underestimate two things: the likelihood of a disaster occurring. As we started this whole thing, I mentioned the Spanish flu. How many of you experienced that? 1918. We haven't experienced anything like this. So we underestimate the likelihood of a disaster coming about. And the second thing is, when a disaster does occur, we underestimate the magnitude of it. Oh, things are not going to be that bad. There's an interesting thread on Twitter, and there's a number of them about what's happening in Italy, and they all echo the same sentiment. They all thought there was nothing of it. Within a matter of 2 to 3 weeks, life has flipped upside down for that country. And people are just numb to it now. They don't even know what happened. It's just they're so bewildered by the transformation that took place in Italy that now they're warning other people and saying, don't be like us. Now, the normalcy bias prevents us from overreacting. And it makes sense, given that true disasters normally, they're rare. Yeah, when was again 1918? So over 100 years ago. Disasters are not a common occurrence. So you don't want to be overreacting to everything, but you need to be aware of this bias because it can make you underestimate things. The opposite to that, or kind of another side of that, is catastrophic thinking. And this refers to a susceptibility to the worst case scenario bias. This is where people magnify and overreact to small problems. And this bias can lead us to fixate on the worst possible outcome in a situation, which can in turn lead us to unnecessary extreme action and poor decision making. Those are the types of people who went out and fought over toilet paper and created the shortages that we see today in supermarkets. So that's catastrophic thinking, that the apocalypse is upon us. The world is going to collapse. You don't have to be go from one extreme to the other extreme. A sensible thing is buy 2 to 4 weeks supply. But to create a shortage and fight in supermarkets and be panicked about it and go into all this anxiety, that is another problem that you need to avoid. So that's catastrophic thinking. The outcome bias, and this is the one that really concerns me personally the most, it's because it's so problematic. If our current efforts at reducing the potential harm of the virus work, it will look like we overreacted, which will give us a false sense of security in the future when another pandemic comes about. So let's say that things don't get as bad as everybody expected them to. What we'll end up doing is we forget that, oh, wait a minute, we did social distancing, we canceled a lot of programs. People won't remember any of this stuff. All they'll recognize is, oh, things weren't that bad. So in the future, if another pandemic is to come about, people won't react with the same diligence that they're acting with right now. A final bias I want you to pay attention to, and this is a really important one to note: availability bias. The more easily and vividly you can recall something, the more likely you'll think it is to be the case. When you combine that with our natural disposition and which internet bubble we happen to be in, you can see how problematic this can be. So if you're a naturally anxious person, you'll interpret ambiguous information in a negative light. And if you happen to be following all the terrible outcomes of this disease to the exclusion of the mild cases, especially if it includes detailed personal stories, you'll think it's the apocalypse. And you'll also mistake the frequency of the outcome of rare events, and you'll think that they're more common. So, when you think about it, it's a low mortality rate, high morbidity, low mortality. But then if you just read about all the negative cases, you'll start to think that, oh my God, everybody's going to die from this. And that's just not the case. It's a high rate. It's serious. We need to pay attention to it. We want to be diligent. But this availability bias is really a problem. And that's what ends up happening on social media. That's why we say don't follow social media, don't follow the news about this. Just read the reports from the WHO, read the reports from the CDC, and just follow the directives that they have. And that should keep you informed. You be alert, you be diligent about all of this stuff, but without losing your wits. Now, finally, what do we do as Muslims given all of this information? Really, it starts off with a single hadith that I want to begin with, or maybe two hadiths. The first hadith is the beloved sallallahu alaihi wasallam said to a man who asked him about his camel, should I tie my camel and trust in Allah, or should I leave her untied and trust in Allah? And the beloved sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, tie her and trust in Allah. In other words, take on the means, do what you got to do, and then have tawakkul, have reliance on Allah. If you don't do that, you have tawakkul, which is having a su' adab. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put these patterns in the world for a reason. And part of respecting those patterns is that you acknowledge their validity. And so you respect them by doing your part. You exercise your part in this game. So when it comes to the directives, when they say social distancing, don't gather in crowds, don't do these things, that's actually based on known disease transmission patterns. It is known infectious rates. It is known morbidities. It is known resources that we have. So they're saying, help us out by not being a vector of transmission for this disease to blow it out of proportion. The other hadith is one in which the beloved sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, if you hear of a plague in a land, then do not go into it. If it happens in land where you are, then do not go out of it. In other words, quarantining. This is what the beloved sallallahu alaihi wasallam is talking about here. Social isolation and quarantining, especially if you know that you have the disease or have a potential of having come into contact with someone that has the disease. Do not spread it around. Generally speaking, our responses to all of these events has to take two things into account: the mulk and the malakut. The mulk refers to the dominion that you see, all of the material stuff. The malakut refers to the ghaib. Now, you can't just say, quote verses from the Quran, for example, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, ظهر الفساد في البر والبحر بما كسبت أيدي الناس, that corruption has been manifest in the land and the sea because of what people have earned, or وما أصابكم من مصيبة فمن أنفسكم, whatever has afflicted you from calamities, it is because of yourself. And then talk to people about, just make tawbah and get back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that's it. Of course, that's part of it. But that's a malakut part of it. Now you're talking about the metaphysical, spiritual dimension of all of this. We as Muslims, we believe that no illness afflicts except by the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. No healing comes about except through the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We acknowledge that, we believe that. But at the same time, اعقلها وتوكل. Tie your camel and then rely on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's where the mulk comes in. Now, the government recommendations, and this is a point that I haven't personally come across anybody addressing this, because a lot of the imams and the mashayikh, they're saying, let's just follow the government directives. You all need to understand something. Government directives are taking into account factors that you as masjid leaders and community leaders do not need to take into account. The government has economic interests, it has political interests, it has global interests. Health is just one aspect of it. So they're actually making real calculations with people's lives. Can we handle more people getting infected by limiting social interaction, for example, or reducing interaction to a degree, but not completely eliminating it, so that we can just nip it in a butt, let's say. So they don't want the economy to collapse. That means they're going to make a calculus with regards to people's lives. This is what Wael Hallaq talks about with regards to the nation state is the new sovereign entity. It is not God Almighty. They don't believe in La ilaha illallah. They believe in nationalism. They believe in national interests. So you can't use government directives and be blind followers to them. You have to take that into account. So you have a community and you're responsible for the livelihood of that community in terms of their health and well-being. So just to simply say that the government is saying, crowds of 250 or 500 is fine, let's just keep the masjid open. I don't think so. Because The virus doesn't really wait. There's a funny meme. The virus is waiting. It's 249 people. The coronavirus is waiting for one more person to show up before it starts to infect everybody. That's not how it works. And we know how Muslims we are. We're very physical in our affection. We hug each other. We get close together. And we don't know. And people, a lot of people are traveling from all over the place. You don't know what you're picking up from where. And this is a dangerous time to be alive right now and to engage in that practice and that activity. So we have to minimize and reduce all of that. You do not need 250 people to get infected with coronavirus. You just need one person. You need a gathering of 20 people with one person to be there to just infect everyone. And I'll turn your attention to South Korea for a second. And the article will be linked in the show notes. The South Koreans were controlling this for 30 patients. With 30 patients, they had really tight control on it. Patient 31 comes along, and this lady doesn't get tested. She does have the symptoms. She goes to church, and then after church, she goes to a buffet, and then finally decides to go to a hospital to get tested. But that's after she's had contact with almost 1,200 people. That's when it just blew out of proportion for South Korea. South Korea had it under tight control until that one patient, and it started off with the church. Now, recently, a couple of days ago, there was a news article released about an event in Malaysia, a mosque event that had people from all over the world. Granted, yeah, people traveled and came in. 16,000 people, a large number. A lot of masajid don't have that. But that actually took the number of infections in Malaysia and put Malaysia as the second worst hit country in Southeast Asia, with 428 total cases. And out of that one event, they had 243 cases. Now, the R naught value of this disease, this virus, is 3 to 4. R naught meaning for each one of those, you're looking at 3 to 4 others that they might have contacted and infected. Now, you do the math and see how much that manifests itself. So, for the mosque leaders, the imams, anybody that is sitting on the fence about this at this moment and has not suspended Jum'ah, and by the way, there is an exchange for Jum'ah. It's called Salat al-Dhuhr. That people can pray and we can suspend going to mosques for now, because this is not a lifelong thing. This is just until this thing passes over, because all of these things have a life cycle. They do, there's تِلْكَ الْأَيَّامُ نُدَاوِلُهَا بَيْنَ النَّاسِ. These are the days that we change between people. Nothing lasts and subsists forever in the way that it does. And even with the exponential increase, eventually it actually asymptotes. It reaches a point where it stops increasing. Now, look at the UK government with their herd immunity thing, just to show you that the government does not have your best interests and they don't calculate your health as as the number one thing that they care about. They said, let's just go for herd immunity. Do you know what that means? It means that you're going to have millions of people suffer and millions die so that you can get what's called herd immunity. They're using a concept from vaccinations with a disease. Vaccinations do not cause the disease. Vaccinations are actually attenuated or dead versions of the disease that just basically trigger your immune system so that you can have herd immunity. So when the real deal comes, like measles or polio, it doesn't have a mass outbreak among the masses. It's not go infect everyone and then hope that whoever survives. What the UK government has done with this herd immunity argument is they're basically doing eugenics. Anybody who can survive this is worthy of being alive. And now we can all be immune to it. And those who die, we've just eliminated them from the population pool. I can't express to you how evil and sinister this is. So once again, those of you who are leading masajid, community centers, if you have group dhikrs, if you have any events that are taking place, postpone and suspend all of this, at least for the next 2 to 4 weeks, and then come back and revisit. And you need to take into account the material causes that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has placed on the earth. Yes, we recognize that there is a metaphysical reality to all of this. There are reasons, it's our own sinfulness. This is a time for us now to go back and basically get into i'tikaf. There are a lot of benefits. Imam Umar Sulaiman shared benefits of now getting into seclusion. And maybe even Ramadan, if this extends into Ramadan, no taraweeh, That's now your opportunity to pray at night and start doing tahajjud and make that a habit of yours. Getting back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in tawbah, seeking forgiveness, paying in charity, doing all of these things so that you can correct your relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The scariest thing of all of this for me personally is not the virus. The scariest thing is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has sent one of his soldiers. وَمَا يَعْلَمُ جُنُودَ رَبِّكَ إِلَّا هُ. None knows the soldiers of your Lord except him. One of his soldiers, this coronavirus, he sent it out to basically block us from coming together and congregating in his houses. Seeing images of the Kaaba empty, the Haram in Mecca empty, the Haram in Medina being also emptied, Masajid, the muadhin in Kuwait, this recent video that was shared, where the muadhin is saying, Sallu fi rihalikum, instead of Hayya ala salat, Hayya ala al-falah, he says, Sallu fi rihalikum, pray in your own dwellings, and then weeps after that. These are the houses of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and you do not get an invite. You do not get to go to these houses of Allah except through an invite. Allah invites you to his house, and then you actually get to go to the masjid. And we've gotten to a point where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, I don't want you here. I can't even begin to describe to you what that does to me. Just for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, don't come. I don't want you in my house. What does that say about us? So we have to take on the means, do your social distancing, suspend all of these things. You decide to come, you decide to go against. I mean, Allah sent you a soldier and said, you come, you're going to get infected. And then you, by making that decision, you end up jeopardizing the lives of people, countless lives, elderly people, people with conditions, and also young people who might, people in their 20s can also get infected in 30s and 40s, and they might die from this as well. That's on you, on Yawm al-Qiyamah. Their blood is going to be on your hands. And it is a homicide as far as I'm concerned, because we know enough about this to know that this is an irresponsible decision to make. So Allah says, don't come through his soldier until you clear that out. How do you clear that out? You practice the material things with the washing of the hands and not having this physical interaction. And if you know someone who's been in a hot zone where there is this disease going around, that they isolate themselves and quarantine themselves for 14 days, and that if you know somebody who's got symptoms or you got symptoms, and you stay away and you seek whatever treatment you can. Yeah, sure. Many of the cases are going to be up to 80-85% of the cases are going to be mild. It's going to suck. It's going to be terrible. But then you get over it, and inshallah, you'll be immune to it, and then you can come back. But this is a short period of time that we're talking about, that we all have to come together. And the reason I don't engage in social interactions at this moment is not for me, and it is not just for you. It's for your loved ones. It's for your parents. It's for your grandparents. Each one of us has a responsibility to all of us, that you do not come around and participate in spreading this disease. So this is serious business. I'm going to leave it at that. All the resources, I hope that this was clear. I'm not sure, but I'm going to release it anyways as such, and hope that it all makes sense. The additional resources, all the references that I've used for this, they're going to be in the show notes. You can go and visit all of these and download all these papers yourselves if you're interested. Obviously, I didn't go into all of the details and didn't discuss every single thing about it. There are a lot of things being discussed around. A final advice regarding individual practice: drink your fluids, eat wholesome food, have your vitamins, and also don't get into a state of panic and stress about it, because we know that stress reduces the immune system's function and efficacy, and therefore you might get sick because you've been stressed out about it. As long as you do the practices and you connect with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, just relax. But please, for God's sakes, just be sensible about this. And if your local masjid has not suspended congregations, has not shut down for Jum'ah, and just said everybody pray Dhuhr until further notice, until we just get past this period of time, pressure them to, because people's lives are at stake here. And if anybody tries to say otherwise, they don't really know what they're talking about. آخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين. You can find resources and additional show notes on Al-Andalus Academy, and I hope that you share this far and wide. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك.
هدي من النعم أقام